The first thing I learned about him was not his name. It was the quality of his silence. Most silences are an absence, a pocket of dead air waiting to be filled. His was a presence. It had weight and density, like a column of cool marble in the center of a room. It was the silence of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, who had never filled a pause with chatter because he was uncomfortable. His silence was a form of gravity. The day he first came to my workshop, the bell over the door didn't so much jingle as it seemed to be reluctantly shaken from a long sleep. It was a Tuesday. I remember this because on Tuesdays the bakery next door made rye bread, and the scent was a thick, yeasty comfort that usually defined the entire afternoon. But when he stepped inside, the air changed. The smell of rye and old paper and linseed oil seemed to thin, to recede to the edges of the room, leaving the center cold and clear. I was hunched over a folio from the 17th century, its leather spine crumbling like dry earth, and I didn't look up immediately. I was stitching a new headband with waxed linen thread, a delicate, repetitive motion that was my own form of meditation. 1 stitch, 2, 3, let them wait. People were always in a hurry. Their urgency was not my own. But the silence stretched. I counted 10 full seconds. No clearing of the throat. No shuffling of feet. Just the unnerving, patient stillness. Finally, I set my needle down and looked up. He was standing just inside the door, which he had closed so quietly I hadn't registered the sound. He was tall, dressed in a suit so dark it seemed to drink the dusty light of the shop. It was a beautiful suit, the kind of tailoring that whispers its expense rather than shouts it. It did not belong here in my world of paper dust and chemical solvents. Neither did he. He was young, younger than his stillness suggested, perhaps 30. His face was a collection of severe, elegant lines. His black hair cut with a precision that mirrored the lines of his suit. He was watching me with an unnerving lack of expression. Not hostile, not friendly. Just watching, as if I were a specimen under glass. I felt my spine straighten, a reflexive defense. Yes, my voice sounded small in the space he had created. He moved then, not toward my counter but toward a table where I had laid out the disbound sections of a book. His movements were economical, fluid. The carpet, worn thin over decades, absorbed every footstep like a secret. He stopped beside the table and looked down at the scattered pages. His hands were clasped behind his back. It is a Mercator Atlas, 1619. His voice was low, a quiet baritone with no discernible accent to my ear, but the cadence was not entirely American. The statement hung in the air. It wasn't a question. It was a fact stated. Yes, it is. He nodded, a barely perceptible motion. He looked at me again. I need something repaired. He gestured to the briefcase in his other hand, an object I hadn't even noticed. It was old, worn leather, a stark contrast to his suit. He placed it on my counter and opened the clasps. The sound was loud in the quiet shop. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a book. It was small, no bigger than my 2 hands, bound in what had once been dark blue leather. It looked like it had been pulled from the sea. The cover was warped, the pages swollen and stained. A disaster. A beautiful, heartbreaking disaster. My breath caught. I reached out, then stopped myself. May I? He gave another of those small, sharp nods. I lifted it. The paper was fragile. The ink bloomed and feathered across the pages. It was handwritten, a journal or a book of poems, the script elegant but obscured by the damage. It smelled of mildew and loss. Water damage is the worst. I spoke to the book, not to him. You can never fully erase it. The memory remains in the fibers of the paper. I can stabilize it. I can halt the decay, mend the tears, rebind it. But it will always carry the scars. I looked up at him, expecting to see disappointment. Instead, his dark eyes were fixed on my hands as I held the book. He seemed to be listening to something other than my words. That is acceptable. He did not ask the cost. He did not ask how long it would take. I told myself it was because men like him didn't think about such things. Money was an abstraction. Time bent to their will. I told myself that, but a deeper, more unsettling thought surfaced. He had already decided I was the one for the job, and the details were an afterthought he had no interest in. "I am a Lara," I said, forcing a professional tone. "This will be a significant undertaking. I'll need to do a full assessment before I can give you an estimate." He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and I felt it like a physical touch. A faint line, a tiny white scar, bisected his left eyebrow, almost invisible unless you were this close. His gaze was so direct it felt like a violation of my personal space, even from 6 feet away. "I have the estimate." He slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was a cashier's check. The number on it made my stomach clench. It was more than I made in a year. It was enough to solve so many problems I had stopped even thinking of them as problems and had started accepting them as permanent features of my life. I pushed it back toward him. "That's not how it works. I do an assessment. I give you a quote. You approve it. Then I take a deposit. Not before." His expression didn't change, but a flicker of something. Surprise? Respect? Moved in his eyes. It was there and gone in a second. He took a pen from his jacket, a simple, heavy fountain pen. He wrote a name and a number on the back of a business card that was blank on the front. "Jinwoo Kwon. Call this number when you have your quote." He left the check on the counter, turned, and walked out. The bell gave its same reluctant shudder. The scent of rye bread slowly, cautiously, seeped back into the center of the room. I stood there for a long time. I counted the seconds. 123. Then I picked up the check. I told myself it was just a job. A difficult, lucrative job. I told myself the man was just a client. Eccentric, wealthy, intense. I knew, even as I thought it, that I was lying. The silence he had left behind was different from the one he had found. It was heavier now, filled with the echo of his presence. It was a silence that listened. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks in which the world outside my workshop faded to a muffled hum. My life shrank to the size of the small, ruined book on my workbench. It was Korean, I discovered. A collection of Seijo poems, a formal poetic style from centuries ago. The ink was iron gall, which had bitten into the handmade paper, a ghost of the words remaining even where the water had washed the rest away. I worked with the patience of a saint, which I am not. I am simply a woman who has learned that the only way to fix something broken is to move slowly. I separated the pages, a Herculean task, letting them dry between sheets of blotter paper under gentle weight. I treated the mildew with a specialized ethanol solution, the sharp scent a constant companion. Each day, I felt I was not just restoring a book, but excavating a life. The poets. And, in a strange, indirect way, Mr. Kwon's. Why this book? Why go to such expense for something so profoundly damaged? I never called the number. I sent my quote, professionally typed, to a corporate address I found associated with his name. A global logistics company with a headquarters that looked like a shard of black glass piercing the sky. I sent it by messenger, a clear and deliberate boundary. You do not call me. I do not call you. We communicate through formal channels. I was fiercely protective of my autonomy. A lesson learned from a past I kept locked away like a book too damaged to even attempt restoring. I had been managed before. Handled. I would not be again. A week after I sent the quote, a man appeared at my door. He was not Jinwoo Kwon. He was older, with a face that seemed carved from impassive stone and hair more silver than black. He wore a simple, dark suit, less severe than Mr. Kwon's but no less intimidating. He introduced himself as Mr. Park. He was here to deliver some materials. He placed a heavy box on my counter. Inside was a ream of antique Japanese paper, the kind that cost a fortune per sheet, perfect for mending the tears in the Korean manuscript. There was also a set of German bookbinding tools I had only ever seen in catalogs. My name is on a waiting list for that all. I said, my voice tight. It is a 3-year list. Mr. Park's expression was placid. A client was kind enough to pass on his position. Client. The word was a smooth, polished stone, offering no purchase. I looked at him, my anger a cold, hard knot in my chest. I cannot accept these. They are not part of the quote. Mr. Park bowed his head slightly. Mr. Kwan felt they would facilitate the quality of the restoration. He is very concerned with quality. I felt a surge of heat in my face. It was a gift, but it felt like a transaction, a way of owning a piece of my process. He was not just buying the result. He was buying his way into my craft. I will add their cost to the final invoice, I said, my voice sharp. Mr. Park's face remained a mask of polite indifference. As you wish. But he did not take the tools. He left them on the counter, a silent testament to a battle I had already lost. 2 weeks after that, my book press broke. It was an old cast-iron beast, the screw mechanism stripped after a century of use. A replacement was thousands of dollars I did not have. The project, and my entire livelihood, ground to a halt. For 2 days I did nothing. I sat in the quiet of my shop and felt the walls closing in. The brief fantasy of financial freedom the Kwan check had offered now seemed like a cruel joke. On the 3rd day, Mr. Park appeared. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply looked at the idle press, then at my face. I imagine I looked as defeated as I felt. He stayed for 3 minutes. He said nothing. He just observed. The following Monday, a truck arrived. 2 men in overalls delivered a brand new, state-of-the-art hydraulic press. It was Italian. It was beautiful. It was a masterpiece of engineering that made my old one look like a medieval torture device. There was no paperwork. No invoice. Just a small, discreet card on top that read, "For the quality of the restoration." I stood in front of it for an hour. I did not touch it. This was not a tool. It was a statement. It was a gilded link in a chain he was forging around me, and I didn't know whether to be furious or grateful. The 2 emotions warred inside me, leaving me exhausted. I told myself I would send it back. I told myself I would walk away from the job, tear up the check, and return to my familiar, manageable poverty. I would not be bought. I would not be owned. That evening, I called Mr. Park's number. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Park, it's Alara. The press. It has to go back." There was a pause, a beat of that weighted silence I was coming to associate with his employer. Mr. Kwan does not accept returned gifts. It is considered an insult. Then tell him I am insulting him. I snapped, my control finally breaking. Tell him I am a bookbinder, not a charity case. I run a business. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could hear my own heart hammering against my ribs. When he finally spoke, his voice was unchanged, still maddeningly calm. "Mr. Kwan does not see it as charity, miss. He sees it as an investment in a satisfactory outcome. Just that. An investment. Cold, clean business term. And yet it felt like a lie." I hung up the phone, my hand trembling. I looked at the press, gleaming under the weak light of my workshop. It was a beautiful, expensive cage, and the door was swinging shut. The matter of my rent was a low, steady hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my days. My landlord, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, had been making noises about a significant increase for months, an increase I could never meet. The eviction notice he'd slipped under my door 2 months ago sat on my desk, a constant, quiet threat. Mr. Kwan's check could have solved it, of course. Could have solved everything. But I hadn't cashed it. It sat in my desk drawer, a fantasy I couldn't bring myself to indulge. To use his money for my life felt like a surrender I wasn't prepared to make. I was still operating on my own dwindling reserves, patching together my existence one small invoice at a time. The pressure was mounting. One afternoon, I broke my own rule of isolation and called Sarah. Sarah was my oldest friend, a lifeline to the person I had been before my world had shrunk to the size of a workshop. She was a kindergarten teacher, her life a loud, colorful, joyful mess of finger paints and scraped knees. Hearing her voice was like stepping into a warm, sunlit room. I explained the situation with the landlord, editing out the part about the handsome, silent benefactor and his blank checks. To Sarah, I was just a Lara, struggling as always. She was full of righteous anger on my behalf. "That's illegal, Alara. He can't just triple the rent. There are tenant unions, legal aid, you have to fight him." I listened to her sensible, practical advice and felt a chasm opening between us. Her world had rules and unions and aid. The world I was now brushing up against had men like Mr. Park and silent, terrifyingly effective solutions. The language she was speaking felt like one I was forgetting. "I'm fine, I'll figure it out," I said, the familiar words a comfort and a lie. I hung up feeling more alone than before. The next day, my phone rang. It was the landlord. His voice, usually slick with false bonhomie, was strained, almost servile. "Miss Alara, about the lease. There's been a change of plans. I've decided to sell the building." I braced myself for the final blow, the 30-day notice. But the new owners, a holding company, a very insistent holding company, they've reviewed all the current leases. They would be honored to have you continue as a tenant. My heart, which had been lodged in my throat, did a slow, painful slide back into place. "They're keeping the rent the same?" He made a sound that was almost a squeak. "Yes. Yes, of course. In fact, they've authorized me to offer you a new 5-year lease. At your current rate. Locked in." He sounded like he was reading from a script with a gun to his head. I was silent. The air in the shop felt thin, hard to breathe. I didn't need to ask the name of the holding company. I knew. I knew as surely as I knew the grain of the wood on my workbench. This was different from the tools, different from the press. This was not about my work. This was about my life. My home. He was reaching into my world and rearranging the furniture, making it safer, more secure. And it terrified me more than any eviction notice ever could. I felt like a plant being carefully repotted into a gilded urn, my roots severed from the stony, difficult soil I knew. When he came, I was ready. The first stage of the restoration was complete. The pages were clean, stable, and mended. They lay in neat stacks, waiting for his inspection. I had rehearsed my speech. It was firm, unequivocal. "Thank you for your assistance, but I cannot accept it. My security is not your responsibility. I will not be managed." He arrived at precisely 3 o'clock. The bell shivered. The scent of rye bread retreated. He wore a dark gray coat this time, the collar turned up against a non-existent wind. Mr. Park was not with him. He was alone. He moved past me to the table, his focus entirely on the transformation of the ruined pages. He did not say hello. He did not acknowledge me at all. He simply stood over the fruits of my labor, his stillness a vortex that pulled all the sound from the room. I opened my mouth to deliver my prepared lines, but the words caught in my throat. They felt brittle, foolish, in the face of his silent concentration. He reached out a single, long finger and traced the edge of a mended page, his touch so light it barely seemed to make contact. He was looking at a line of poetry, the black ink a stark, clean thread against the creamy, ancient paper. "Does my assistance insult you?" He spoke without looking at me. The question was so direct, so devoid of artifice, it bypassed all my defenses. My rehearsed speech crumbled to dust. My anger, my fear, my rigid insistence on autonomy. It all felt like a child's tantrum. I swallowed. "Frightens me." The admission was quiet, barely a whisper, but it was the truest thing I had said to anyone in years. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. I counted the ticks of the old clock on the wall. 4, 5, 6. He finally lifted his head and looked at me. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm control. But his eyes held a strange, somber light. And then it happened. The barest, quickest lift at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile. It was the ghost of a smile, a suggestion of one that had been considered and then dismissed. It was the most expressive thing I had ever seen him do. "You are not for sale," he said, his voice as quiet and certain as a prayer. "You are for protecting." He held my gaze for 2 seconds longer than the conversation required. Then he turned his attention back to the book. The distinction he drew hung in the air between us, shimmering and dangerous. He hadn't refuted my fear. He had simply redefined his actions. And in doing so, he had changed the entire landscape of my world. I was no longer an employee. I was something else, and I had no idea what that meant. I told myself he was a ghost, Declan. A ghost from a past life, a story I no longer read. 6 years of silence should have been enough to exorcise him. When his name appeared on my phone screen one rainy Thursday, my first instinct was that it was a mistake, a phantom signal from a dead satellite. I let it ring, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. He didn't leave a message. But the next day, a note was tucked into the handle of my workshop door. A single sheet of cheap, lined paper, the handwriting a spiky, aggressive slant I knew as well as my own. Heard you landed on your feet, Ilara. We should catch up. You owe me that much. Owe him. The audacity of it was a bitter taste in my mouth. I had left him with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and a debt he had run up in my name. A debt that had taken me 4 years of scrimping and starving to pay off. I owed him nothing but the silence I had given him. I tore the note into tiny pieces and threw it away, but the gesture felt hollow. He was here. He had found me. That knowledge was a corrosive acid, eating away at the fragile peace I had built. My work had always been my sanctuary, the precise, methodical nature of it a balm for any anxiety. But now my hands shook. I measured a sheet of mending paper 3 times and still cut it crooked. The fear of Declan was a phantom limb, an ache from an old amputation, and it was making me clumsy. It was making me a danger to the one thing in my life that felt pure, the book. I had another meeting scheduled with Jinwoo Kwon. This time it was not at my shop. His assistant had called, a crisp, female voice, and requested my presence at his residence to consult on the climate control systems for his collection. His residence. The word itself felt heavy. I knew it would be the Black Glass Tower. I knew it would be high above the city, a place of silent, sterile perfection. And I was right. Mr. Park met me in a lobby that felt more like a modern art museum, all soaring white marble and unnerving silence. The elevator ride was a smooth, soundless ascent that made my ears pop. 38 floors in 30 seconds. I counted. The apartment was vast. And empty. Not empty of furniture. The pieces were sparse, elegant, and looked like they cost more than my entire workshop, but empty of life. The walls were glass, revealing a panoramic, breathtaking view of the city below, a sprawling, indifferent circuit board of light and motion. There was no art on the walls, no photographs, no clutter. It was a space that revealed nothing about its occupant. An older woman with a kind, wrinkled face and her hair in a neat bun greeted me at the door. She bowed and introduced herself as Mrs. Choi. She led me to a sitting area and brought me a cup of tea. It was barley tea, the roasted, nutty aroma a sudden, unexpected comfort. Mrs. Choi's smile was small and knowing, as if she understood I needed this small anchor of warmth in this cold, beautiful place. Jinwoo emerged from a hallway I hadn't noticed. He was dressed not in a suit, but in simple black trousers and a soft, gray cashmere sweater. The casual attire was somehow more disarming than his corporate armor. He led me to his library. The room was a shock. While the rest of the apartment was a study in minimalist restraint, the library was a warm, living space, lined floor to ceiling with dark wood shelves overflowing with books. Old books. The air smelled of leather and paper and age. It smelled like my workshop. Smelled like home. This is the only room that matters, he said, running a hand along a row of leather-bound spines. He spoke more here. He showed me a first edition of a poet I admired, a rare manuscript on celestial navigation. He spoke about them not as investments, but as living things, each with a story. For a few minutes, he was not the intimidating titan of industry. He was a man who loved books. I saw the scholar in him, the quiet soul that existed beneath the layers of power and control. I found myself relaxing, the knot of tension in my shoulders beginning to unwind. We were discussing the optimal humidity for vellum when I gestured to a high shelf, explaining a point about air circulation. As I lowered my arm, I brushed a smudge of graphite from my drafting pencil onto my cheek. He stopped talking, his gaze fixed on the mark. There was a fractional hesitation, a stillness in him that was different from his usual composure. It was a moment of decision. Then he lifted his hand. His fingers were long and elegant. He moved slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal. His thumb came to rest on my cheek, impossibly gentle. The warmth of his skin was a sudden shock, a jolt of heat that traveled through my entire body. For a single, breathless second, he simply held it there, his thumb against my skin, his dark eyes searching mine. Then he swiped the graphite away. I flinched, not from fear, but from the sheer, unexpected intimacy of the touch. It was too much, too soon. My defenses, so carefully constructed, flew up like startled birds. I took a half step back, breaking the contact. The change in him was immediate. His hand dropped. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by that familiar, shuttered composure. The mask was back in place. The moment, fragile as a butterfly's wing, was broken. "Forgive me," he said, his voice flat. He turned back to the bookshelf, and the conversation about humidity and vellum resumed as if nothing had happened. But it had. A line had been crossed, and in the vast, silent apartment, high above the sleeping city, the space between us was now charged with the memory of a single, fleeting touch. Declan didn't just knock on the door anymore. He started to kick it. The first time I found the heel print on the wood, a muddy smear near the lock, a cold dread snaked up my spine. He was testing the boundaries. He was losing patience. The notes became more frequent, more demanding. "I know you're in there, Ilara. Don't be stupid. People are looking for me. That means they'll be looking for you." The lie was so transparent it was almost pathetic. No one was looking for Declan. He was a ghost, a drifter. The people he owed money to had likely written him off years ago. No, this was about him thinking I had struck gold. He'd seen the new press through the window, maybe caught a glimpse of Mr. Park's sedate black car. He'd cobbled together a fantasy of my new life and decided he was entitled to a piece of it. My work, once my refuge, became a source of constant anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow passing the window, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I started locking the door even when I was inside, something I'd never done. I was a prisoner in my own sanctuary. I told myself I could handle it. I had handled Declan before. I was stronger now, smarter. I would not let him drag me back into the chaos. This was my problem, my past, and I would deal with it myself. To admit this failure, this vulnerability, to Jinwoo Quan felt like an unbearable defeat. It would prove I was what Declan's note implied, a liability. So I said nothing. I worked with a frantic, obsessive energy, pouring all my fear into the restoration of the book. Its quiet, ordered world of paper and thread was the only place I felt sane. One afternoon, Mr. Park appeared. It was not a scheduled day for a visit. There was no pretense of delivering materials. He simply let himself in with a key I had not given him and stood in the middle of the room. The sight of him was so unexpected that I dropped a bone folder, which clattered loudly on the floor. He did not look at the book. He did not look at me. His gaze went directly to the small wastebasket beside my desk. Inside, crumpled but still legible, was Declan's latest note. I had meant to burn it. My face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. How dare he? How dare he walk into my space and read my trash and look at me with that placid, all-knowing expression? He bent down, his movements precise, and plucked the crumpled ball of paper from the bin. He smoothed it out on my workbench, read the spiky, desperate words, and then looked at me. His face was, as always, a mask, but his eyes were hard. They were the eyes of a man assessing a threat. He did not ask who Declan was. He did not ask why he was threatening me. He refolded the note, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and said the only thing that mattered. "Mr. Kwan has been informed." I felt a wave of dizzying, contradictory emotions. Fury first and foremost, a white-hot rage at this invasion, this complete and utter disregard for my privacy, for my ability to manage my own life. And under it, a deep, dark, shameful current of relief. The burden, which I had been carrying alone for weeks, had been lifted. Someone else was carrying it now. Someone immensely, terrifyingly capable. The loss of my autonomy was so absolute it was almost peaceful. I had fought so hard to keep him out, to keep my life separate, And in one quiet moment, the wall had been breached completely. There was nothing left to defend. Later that day, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, low and smoky. "Is this Alara? My name is Jisoo. I own the gallery in the next block. I know who you are. I've seen you work. I've also seen your new patron. He is a client of mine. Or rather, his family is. A long-time client." I was confused. Why was she calling me? She seemed to sense my question. "I'm calling to give you a piece of unsolicited advice. Because you have a kind face and you look like you don't know the rules of the game you're in." Her voice was not unkind, but it was sharp, honed by years of navigating a world I was just discovering. With men like Jinwoo Kwon, there is only one currency that holds its value: honesty. Do not hide things from him. Do not pretend to be fine when you are not. It doesn't make you look strong. It makes you look foolish. And it makes his job harder. His job? I asked, my voice small. Protecting his assets. Her voice was wry. She paused, then added, and whatever else he has decided is his to protect. Don't be a locked room, Alara. They have ways of getting in anyway. It's better if you just open the door. She hung up, leaving me in a silence that was suddenly filled with a terrifying clarity. I had been trying to be a locked room, and she was right. He had gotten in anyway. I should have gone home. I knew it was getting late. The sky outside my workshop window a bruised purple deepening to black. But the fear of what might be waiting for me in the alley, of who might be watching my apartment, kept me rooted to my stool. Here, at least, I had four walls and a heavy door. Here I had the book. I was burnishing the new leather cover, the repetitive motion of the agate stone smoothing the grain, bringing up a low, lustrous sheen. The scent of the leather was rich and clean. The book was almost whole again. The thought was a small point of light in the growing darkness. And then the light went out. Not just my small desk lamp, but all the lights in the workshop. A sudden, plunging blackness that was absolute. My heart seized. I froze, my hands still on the book, every nerve ending screaming. It wasn't a power outage. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the bakery next door. Someone had cut the power. I held my breath, straining to hear over the frantic drumming in my ears. A scraping sound at the back door. The lock. He was picking the lock. My body moved before my mind could. I slid off the stool, grabbing the heaviest thing I could find. My cast iron finishing press, a solid block of metal. I backed away from the door, my body flattened against the shelves, my knuckles white around the cold iron. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. A silhouette stood there, black against the fainter black of the alley. Declan. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey reached me first. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Alara, you in here, playing hide and seek? His voice was a low, wheedling drawl, laced with a menace that was all too real. I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. My only hope was that he would think the shop was empty and leave. But then his phone's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing wildly around the room, illuminating jars of pigment, stacks of paper, the gleam of my new hydraulic press. There you are. The beam found me, pinning me against the shelves. I flinched, raising the finishing press higher. Get out, Declan. My voice was a reedy tremor. Now, is that any way to talk to an old friend? He took a step inside, the door swinging shut behind him. He looked gaunt. His eyes sunk into his skull, glittering with a desperate, feral light. I just need a loan, Alara. You're doing so well. Look at this place. All this fancy equipment. Your new boyfriend won't even miss it. He took another step. He wasn't just here for money. He was here to punish me for leaving him, for daring to build a life without him. He was here to smash it all. Stay back. I warned, the press feeling impossibly heavy. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Or what? You'll hit me? You don't have it in you. He lunged. I swung the press, a desperate, clumsy arc. He caught my wrist, his grip like iron. The press fell to the floor with a sickening thud. He twisted my arm behind my back, slamming me against the workbench. The book. It slid, teetering on the edge. No. The word was torn from my throat. And then the front door opened. It didn't crash. It didn't splinter. It just opened with a quiet, decisive click. In the frame stood Mr. Park. His face was granite. And behind him, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the street, was Jin-Woo Kwon. Declan froze. He saw Mr. Park first and sneered. "Who the hell are you? Security?" Then he saw Jin-Woo, and the sneer dissolved. The change was instantaneous. The desperate bravado evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of a prey animal that has just realized the hunter is in the room. Jin-Woo did not raise his voice. He did not move from the doorway. He just looked at Declan, his stillness more potent than any threat. "Let her go." His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. For a second, Declan's hand tightened on my arm. A last stupid act of defiance. Mr. Park took one silent step into the room. Declan released me so suddenly I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the table. He raised his hands, a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Hey man, no trouble. We were just talking." Jin-Woo's gaze didn't waver. "Get out." 2 words. They were not a request. They were a command that rearranged the molecules in the air. Declan practically scrambled over himself to obey, fumbling with the back door and disappearing into the night. It was over, just like that. The silence that descended was thick, heavy, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in my knees and radiated through my entire body. The book was safe. It lay on the floor by the bench, its new cover pristine. Jin-Woo walked toward me, his steps measured, soundless. He stopped a few feet away. He didn't touch me. He didn't try to comfort me. He just stood there, a silent, solid presence in the wreckage of my sanctuary. "You are hurt." It was a statement of fact. "I'm fine." The words were automatic, a reflex honed over a lifetime of pretending. They sounded absurd even to my own ears. He looked at me, his head tilted slightly, and for the first time the almost smile didn't vanish. It stayed, deepening into something sad and knowing and unbearably gentle. "No, you are not," he said, his voice soft, "but you will be." He took me to the penthouse. It wasn't a question or a request. Mr. Park drove, the city lights smearing past the blacked-out windows. I sat in the back, as far from Jin-Woo as I could get, wrapped in a silence that was different now. It was no longer just his. It was ours, a shared space filled with the unspoken events of the night. I felt dismantled. The carefully constructed fortress of my independence had been breached, and not by him, but by the crude, violent intrusion of my past. He hadn't stormed the gates. He had simply walked in after they had been kicked down. At the apartment, Mrs. Choi was waiting. Her kind face was etched with a quiet concern that was more comforting than 1,000 words of sympathy. She took one look at me, my torn sleeve, the wild look in my eyes, and simply nodded, taking the coat Jin-Woo had draped over my shoulders. She led me to a bathroom that was bigger than my entire workshop, all slate and steam, and drew a bath. She laid out clothes on the bed in a guest room, a soft pair of cotton pants and a gray sweater that I knew, with a pang, was his. The cashmere one. The care was silent, meticulous, and overwhelming. I soaked in the tub until the water grew cool, trying to wash away the feeling of Declan's hands on me, the smell of his desperation. When I emerged, wrapped in a thick towel, I felt scoured clean, but hollowed out. Dressed in clothes that were not mine, in a home that was not mine, I was unmoored. I found him standing by the vast glass wall in the living room, looking down at the city. The endless grid of lights was a cold, glittering tapestry below. He didn't turn when I entered. He knew I was there. I stood several feet behind him, my arms wrapped around myself, the soft cashmere of his sweater a strange comfort against my skin. The silence stretched, and this time I didn't count the seconds. The time for counting was over. I was the one who broke it. "Men like you don't choose girls like me." The words came out quiet, flat, stripped of all emotion. It was a truth I had held in my heart from the beginning. We're a liability, a loose end, A brief, messy distraction before you move on to someone more suitable. Someone from your own world. Someone who doesn't come with ghosts who kick down doors. He remained with his back to me, his reflection a dark, still shape against the luminous city. For a long time he said nothing. I thought perhaps he hadn't heard me, or had chosen to ignore the raw, painful honesty of the admission. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, contemplative. When I was 19, my father sent me to study in America. He thought it would soften my edges. He sent me alone. He gave me money, an apartment, a car. He thought that was enough. He was wrong. I was reckless. I made a mistake. A bad one. I trusted the wrong person. Cost me more than money. He lifted a hand and touched the faint, silvery scar that cut through his eyebrow. I have never made that mistake again. I do not trust easily. I do not invest in things that are not sound. He turned around slowly. The light from the city cast his face in shades of bruised gold and deep shadow, making his features seem both harsher and more vulnerable. He looked at me, and his eyes were dark, serious, stripped of all masks. I do not choose distractions, Ilara. His voice was soft, but it held a core of unshakable certainty. I choose what is rare, and what is strong, even when it doesn't know its own strength. He closed the distance between us in 2 silent steps. He didn't reach for me, didn't try to comfort me. He simply stood before me, his presence a shield. And then he held out his hand. He didn't gesture for me to take it. He just offered it, palm up, a quiet, unconditional offering. He took my hand, the one that still felt tainted by Declan's grip, and folded it into his. His thumb began to trace slow, soothing circles on my palm, a steady, grounding pressure. The gesture was so simple, so profound, it unraveled the last of my defenses. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just held my hand, his warmth seeping into my cold skin. Mine if you choose it. The words were a quiet declaration, not a question, not a demand, an offer. An entire world, dangerous and beautiful and complicated, laid at my feet. All I had to do was choose. The week that followed was a strange, suspended period, like the moment of stillness at the apex of a pendulum's swing. I stayed at the penthouse. I slept in the quiet guest room, ate the simple, nourishing meals Mrs. Choi prepared, and wore his soft gray sweaters, which seemed to hold a faint trace of his scent. Something clean and sharp like cedar and winter air. I was healing, though the wounds were not visible. Of Declan, nothing was said. One afternoon, Mr. Park arrived and handed Jinwoo a single, sealed manila envelope. Jinwoo read the single sheet of paper inside, his expression unreadable. Then he walked to the sleek, modern fireplace, ignited it with the touch of a button, and dropped the paper into the flames. He watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash. The threat was over, neutralized, erased. I knew I would never see or hear from Declan again. The finality of it was both a profound relief and a chilling testament to the silent, invisible power that now surrounded me. My old life felt 1,000,000 miles away, a distant country I could no longer visit. My friend Sarah called, her voice frantic with a week's worth of accumulated worry. "Where have you been? Are you okay? I saw the lights were off at your shop. I was so scared. I stood on the